how the people are doing. So, man, it has been a while since I made a video. Hectic few weeks to say the least, but let's get back to business, shall we? Because today we are pitting two of my favorite ultras against each other. And here's the thing, I believe that there is quite a misconception about the Galaxy S25 Ultra, because a lot of people do believe that it just hasn't had any realistic upgrades, especially in the cameras department. That is absolutely not true. You may not be a believer, obviously, if you can see things objectively and are, well, a camera enthusiast to say the least, then you would probably know that the S25 Ultra has had quite a few things that have been changed both in the software and hardware departments, and these are all welcome changes. Can things be improved further? Obviously, that goes for every single flagship that exists and has ever existed on this planet. But, well, let's see how things go, shall we? Especially against the Xiaomi 14 Ultra. Now, yes, I know the Xiaomi 15 Ultra is apparently just a little while away. Like, it's supposed to come out in March, which feels crazy, thinking that I can just get my hands on the Xiaomi 15 Ultra. Oh man, that's exciting to say the least. But for now, let's jump in. And as usual, we are starting off with the color profiles. Now, I'll admit to one thing. I completely forgot to take the default color profile shot on the S25 Ultra. So what we have here is a custom color profile that you can have on the S25, and this is a welcome change. Now, to be very clear, this did exist before in previous generations in the Pro mode. But let's be honest, most people who are regularly interested in cameras and not in pro photography specifically will never actually go into Pro mode and figure out that you can just do this. Now, I'm sure over time you might do that, but in general, you want to stick with auto photography. That's usually what most people do, and that's exactly what we're comparing in a camera comparison. On the Xiaomi, of course, we don't really have that much customizability, which is odd to say the least, but, well, we do get Like Vibrant, which as you can see is vibrant. Not my favorite thing, as you can probably tell, because I like Authentic a lot more. It is by far one of my all-time favorite color profiles. It's not perfect, there's a lot of problems with it, but it is just stunning in the way it is and just how unapologetic it can be. I really like it, personally speaking. It speaks to me, it speaks to the style of photography that I enjoy the most, which is high contrast, low saturation, natural looking colors. Well, fairly natural looking colors. It's not perfectly natural, not all the time at least, but it is quite something to behold. Now on the S25 Ultra, believe it or not, there's actually a lot of contrast that I'm adding with the custom color profile. But it's still nowhere near as high contrast as the Xiaomi 14 Ultra's Like Authentic. That's just how far it tends to go. Is that really a good thing? I'm not sure everyone's going to agree, because in a lot of these shots, as you can probably tell, the S25 is significantly better balanced. It may not look as punchy or as high contrast initially, but the overall look of the shot is much more balanced as opposed to the Xiaomi 14 Ultra, which I'm just going to assume is exactly what most people want. And there's also the fact that the Xiaomi can have a tendency to blow out highlights much more often as well, ever so often. It's not always all that bad, and it's especially odd because in regular shots, it can blow out highlights, as you can probably tell, but when it comes to HDR situations. Now, in this case, as you can probably tell, the Xiaomi is just going crazy with the HDR processing, which is an anomaly to say the least. It usually doesn't do that. As we saw previously in the other shots, it would just blow out highlights like the S25 Ultra, which, despite the fact that it's blowing out highlights, I think it actually looks less processed, less artifact around the edges of our subject as well. So even though initially I kind of liked how the Xiaomi looked, upon closer inspection, upon really looking into how we are getting all these artifacts around the edges of our subject plant over here, I actually prefer the S25. But then in this case, I think now the Xiaomi looks much better, much less artifacted, much less processed. Even though it is preserving the highlights significantly better than the S25 Ultra, it is definitely a lot more pleasing to the eye, a lot more natural, and yeah, I do think this time the Xiaomi is actually pulling ahead. Now with the ultra-wide camera, it's a very, very similar situation. Now one thing that I didn't actually talk about previously is that the S25 Ultra, it has a very significant tendency to neutralize the image with the white balance. Basically, it will overcompensate for any warm lights. As you can probably tell in a lot of these shots, warm light is prevalent and is dominant. The Xiaomi is able to maintain that warmth without going overboard really well. And that's why a lot of the times it might look like the S25 Ultra is just washed out or undersaturated. It's actually just missing out on the warmth. It's that simple. And this has just been the case ever since launch, so there's really nothing much that we can do about it. And one last thing that the Xiaomi 14 Ultra does slightly better than the S25 is giving us a wider field of view. Now, the reason it is so good is because most of the new flagships that are coming out, they are quite guilty of reducing the field of view on the ultra-wide camera constantly, which kind of just makes the ultra-wide not exactly all that ultra-wide. And then this shot in particular, I think this just completely summarizes exactly what I've been talking about. You see, most of this shot is dominated by white lights, and there's very little bit of warmth happening, especially just inside the store. So the S25 Ultra is perfectly balanced. It has exactly the right amount of saturation. It has fairly good contrast, not as much as the Xiaomi 14 Ultra, as you can probably tell. But then the Xiaomi is also blowing out highlights. So that's the thing. Saturation is handled fairly well, and it does give you a very natural look on the S25 Ultra. But the problem is that white balance, as long as you don't take warm shots, you're fine. But if you take shots that are either during sunset or have a lot of warm light in general, then it's gonna be a problem. Now then, dynamic range with the ultra-wide camera. So the Xiaomi 14 Ultra, it is doing about as well as I would have expected, to be entirely honest. But then the S25, interestingly enough, it kind of decided to almost focus or expose for the face in my painting, and it basically overexposed the entire image, and that doesn't look all that nice. Now it does. There's this weird processing going on, it looks washed out and a little too like a smartphone image is the best way to put it. Now I did manage to get a relatively normally exposed shot at the end, but well, there are some other problems that have arisen because of this. So I in general prefer the Xiaomi's approach because not only do we get really nice colors, fairly good shadow detail, and the overall sharpness is actually higher than the S25 Ultra. The thing is, with the highlights, Xiaomi is handling it very naturally. It's not trying or it's not giving an overhanded approach where it's unnecessarily reducing the highlights or trying to process it way too much. And that's exactly what's happening on the S25 Ultra. We have these three very distinctive spots of blown out highlights, which makes no sense. And the rest of it is being controlled aggressively and there's no natural roll off. Now, yes, I understand to an extent this is unrealistic, but that's the whole point of camera comparison, right? To test the limits. Now, actually, speaking of limits, the macro photography, it's interesting on both. On the Xiaomi 14 Ultra, we have an arguably inferior macro photography mode, which basically uses a 3x telephoto camera, but it's not able to get nearly as close. Now, on the S25 Ultra, we actually get ultra-wide macro photography. It's really odd to see that we still, to this date, do not get telephoto macro options on the S25. It just feels like such a missed out feature. But well, that's just the way it is. Now, honestly, yes, it can get closer, but it's not my favorite, mainly because it looks a little odd. It doesn't look as natural, or it doesn't have as much depth of field. It ends up with a whole bunch of distortion because of the ultra-wide approach. So it doesn't look as nice. It's also really finicky. I had to take like 10 different shots just to get this one right. It kept switching up to the main camera, and that's... God, it was annoying. But of course, given the whole point of macro is to get us close to the subject, I guess the S25 does pull ahead. However, what about 2x sensor crop? So without any further ado, let's crop all the way in, and this is interesting. 2x sensor crop actually has more sharpening happening on the Xiaomi 14 Ultra. See, this is not something I expected because the Xiaomi usually has a very gentle touch when it comes to sharpening, but that does not seem to be the case here because you can visibly see that the textures are being brought out by sharpening. There's literal sharpening artifacts present on the Xiaomi 14 Ultra. I did not expect that in the slightest. But then what about 3x? Now, 3x is actually not too shabby on the Xiaomi 14 Ultra. While the S25 Ultra's 3x is by far some of the worst that we have had. It doesn't have any high res or anything like that. It's a very low quality sensor, just 10 megapixels, and it's not the megapixel count that matters, but the sensor quality itself is not very good. And cropping all the way in, it is beyond obvious that it just does not look nearly as nice as the Xiaomi 14 Ultra. It does not have as much natural detail as the Xiaomi 14 Ultra. But then of course the 5x. Now that's actually really good on both. Both phones tend to have really nice and very high quality 5x shots available. And yes, once again, the S25, as you can probably tell, it is removing the warmth, and it gets annoying after a certain amount of time, let me tell you. Now obviously, I really want to inspect the details here, so instead of zooming in on the 5x, we're going to take a look at 10x. And so after a 500% crop, this is interesting. This is a very different approach that we have on both. See, now this is the kind of shot that I would expect from the Xiaomi 14 Ultra. Zero sharpening, only noise reduction going on, and that's the only processing artifact that we have. There's no sharpening going on almost at all. Now on the S25 Ultra, Yes, it does look washed out, but it also definitively has more grain and sharpening, so I guess noise reduction is also less on the S25, which I would say in this particular case is not too shabby. It actually looks fairly nice and fairly detailed. There are a lot of minor details that are much more visible on the S25 because of the approach that it is taking in terms of processing and sharpening. So look, when it comes to zoom, I think it's beyond obvious that long range, you're going to be fine with both, but 3x is really where the Xiaomi pulls ahead, and that's really sad because the S25 is supposed to be the new flagship, right? But then we also have the high resolution side of things. We got to take a look at that. So with 50 megapixels, it would appear that both phones are very similarly detailed. I wouldn't say one is particularly more detailed than the other, but do bear in mind, the S25 Ultra does come in with a hefty 200 megapixel mode, and that, I would assume, just like anyone else, that we should get more detail with the 200 megapixels to say the least. I mean, what else is even the point, right? But bear in mind that the S25 requires a lot of light when it comes to 200 megapixels, so I'm not really sure what to expect. Let's crop it and find out. How well would you look at that? So there is definitely less sharpening going on the S25 Ultra's 200 megapixel shot as opposed to the 50 megapixel mode that we saw previously, but it's not a massive difference. So naturally, as I had assumed, having less light really impacts the 200 megapixel mode. Now, I know for a fact that the S25 can produce obscenely detailed images with its main camera with the 200 megapixel mode. I tested out in the previous comparison when we had actual sunlight, and well, it excelled at it. And then of course the ultra wide camera. Now the interesting thing here is that after almost 5 years of requiring a sensor upgrade, the S25 Ultra finally has one. And as usual, we are cropping all the way in. So the approach is very, very drastically different on both. The Xiaomi 14 Ultra just does not sharpen, as you would have expected at this point probably. But then the S25 Ultra, it sharpens and it uses AI processing a lot with the ultra wide camera. It doesn't do that as much with the main camera, but with the ultra wide, as you can probably tell, there's this weird upscaling artifact that's going on. I'm assuming that's AI processing, and that's exactly what's causing the problem here. There's also more sharpening, but we also get significantly more detail as opposed to the Xiaomi. So honestly, I'm not the biggest fan of either approaches, but I guess if I had to pick one, I'd pick the more natural approach on the Xiaomi 14 Ultra. Something in between the two would be perfect if you think about it. And then of course the 3x, which is completely trash on the S25 Ultra, so not exactly a lot to compare. I mean, you can tell even with basic 10 megapixels, it's not able to handle the highlights. So it's really not good. Really not worthy of an Ultra device, now is it? I mean, think about it. Not only is the Xiaomi using high resolution, it is also able to maintain significantly better dynamic range. But then of course the 5x cameras on both. Now, these were really high quality and they were really close on the regular 12 megapixels, so what about the 50? This is definitely an interesting approach that we have on both. So the S25 Ultra has a lot of grain and maybe noise reduction artifacts as well, which, well, the noise reduction isn't really working all that well now, is it? Because we can see a lot of grain in there. The Xiaomi, on the other hand, I think it's just doing a better job because yes, there's some artifacting, there's some sharpening and processing that we can see, but overall it is way cleaner. And a lot of the textures are still popping out despite being a lot cleaner on the Xiaomi. I would say the Xiaomi pulls ahead by a little bit, not a massive margin, but I think it still counts by quite a lot given that it's last year's flagship. But for now, let us move on to the front cameras with the selfies. So, as you can probably tell, the S25 Ultra tends to have really nice contrast, even with just how overcast and how flat the lighting was in general. And well, I would say the overall balance is significantly better on the S25. However, in this backlit selfie, it's actually performing really well on the Xiaomi 14 Ultra because as you can see, it's not only able to give us really good skin tones, its dynamic range is technically better. Now, in general, I do prefer how the S25 is handling the highlight, particularly because the spots being blown out on the Xiaomi, even though, yeah, technically, I guess it is doing a better job, it is able to handle it better, but I don't know, it looks really unpleasant, just the way the highlights are being handled on the Xiaomi. I actually prefer it to be more blown out on the S25. At this point, it's probably just a personal preference that I've got. Now, when it comes to selfie portraits, I would say that it's pretty much the same as the regular selfies, although I do think that the Xiaomi's edge detection can sometimes be a little bit better as opposed to the S25 Ultra. But outside of that, the look of the image overall in general is a little bit better on the S25. It is able to handle contrast, saturation, skin tones, all that jazz a little bit better, not as flat as the Xiaomi. And when it comes to the backlit selfie portrait, I'd say both are performing fairly similar. The S25 has slightly better skin tones, or I'd say slightly more saturated skin tones, but there's some weird smoothing going on my face, which I'm not the biggest fan of. But now, when it comes to rear camera portraits, let's just say that with 1x, 35mm specifically on the Xiaomi 14 Ultra, which for some reason we can't do on the S25 Ultra, is an odd limitation because the 1x sensor is more than good enough of handling a 35mm crop, but it doesn't have the option. But alongside that, we also have the 2x. So anything with the main sensor, it looks pretty much stunning. You're not gonna have any real issues when it comes to 1x, 35mm or 50mm on either of these devices. But when it comes to anything beyond that, I have noticed that both phones will start to struggle in different ways. Like the Xiaomi will ramp up the contrast a little too much, the S25 will try to flatten the image out a little too much. I can tell you right now, there are devices that can do significantly better and are significantly more consistent across all focal lengths as opposed to both of these two combined. Now, these are not even the worst results. Like, I've had significantly worse, especially on the S25 Ultra. Maybe it's because of the lighting I was in, it just somehow managed to get decent results, but I've had some wildfires, to say the least, from the S25, and well, that's not exactly nice, now is it? It is especially a problem because when it comes to portraits, you really need very high degree of consistency and almost near perfection, but that's not the case on either. Now, when it comes to night portraits, I'd say both are performing really well. Like, once again, as long as you're using the main camera for your portraits, it's gonna be more than good enough. So up to 2x, you're fine. But anything beyond that with like 3x or 5x portraits, it can get dicey on both. And now finally we have night mode. So this is particularly interesting for me because night mode is one of my all-time favorites when it comes to the Xiaomi 14 Ultra, because we can utilize Leica Authentic. And as the name indicates, it will provide you with one of the most authentic and one of the most nighttime looking shots that you could ever hope for. It's honestly one of the absolute best out there. There are quite a few phones that are kind of catching up, like the Vivo X200 Pro is catching up. Even the S25 Ultra, not quite as good, but it is catching up. It is trying to give you more of a nighttime, more of a dark looking shot, as opposed to just over brightening everything and just looking bland. But despite that, I still think that the Xiaomi is a reigning champion when it comes to night mode, especially if you're just using the main camera, and it just, man, it turns out looking so beautiful, so high contrast as opposed to anything even the S25 can produce. It's close once again on the S25. Like, this is a very good approach that we have on the S25, very balanced, and it is a very similar story with the ultra wide camera, as you can probably tell. Honestly, there's really nothing much that I have to complain about when it comes to the Xiaomi's night mode. Now, the S25 Ultra, as I previously stated, it has gotten a lot better to the point that I don't mind using it. Yes, if given a choice, I would definitely pick the Xiaomi 14 Ultra for its night mode and for its natural approach. But the S25 it's gotten a lot better, especially with the ultra wide night mode. If you didn't know about this, well, ultra wide night mode was one of the absolute worst on Galaxy devices for a very long time. Even the S25 Ultra had one of the worst flagship ultra wide night mode because of just how bad the sensor was. But with the sensor upgrade, we're actually getting quite nice shots now. But look, it's very obvious which one I prefer, so let's move on and check out zoom at night. So this is 2x, and as usual, we shall crop all the way into 500%. It's actually surprisingly similar on both. I expected some major differences, but it's not really the case. Yes, there's definitely some haloing and maybe extra bits of sharpening on the S25 Ultra, especially if you look at the lights. Those definitely don't look nearly as natural as the Xiaomi 14 Ultra, but it's a minor difference. Now, next up we have 3x. Now, as I've previously stated, 3x just doesn't really work out all that well, and also just take a look at the difference in contrast. The Xiaomi is like miles ahead already and we haven't even cropped in. Speaking of, let us crop all the way in, and yes, the Xiaomi definitely has some artifacting going on. This seems to be something that stems from motion blur more than anything else. There's also some weird artifacts with the lights on both, but yeah, overall the Xiaomi still takes a win in my books because it just looks so much nicer. Sure, it has some artifacting going on, but The S25 has basically no detail. But then of course things are supposed to at least get much closer when it comes to 5x because both phones do have really nice sensors, don't they? Now, I don't know what's going on the S25 Ultra. It's got these weird light rays happening, which, well, it's interesting to say the least. I'm not sure why it's happening. The Xiaomi, as usual, perfect shot. Clean, beautiful, but actually, let me take that back. It's not perfect because when we crop in, it's plenty obvious that we have a significant problem on the Xiaomi 14 Ultra, and this is a problem that has existed ever since the Xiaomi 14 Ultra launched. It has gotten better to a small extent, but motion blur is, well, it's horrendous. It can be a huge problem when you're trying to take a night mode shot with 5x. Now, are you really gonna go around taking 5x night mode shots? If you have the Burj Khalifa, then sure, yeah, I can definitely see it. I mean, that thing is a tall building and 5x can look really nice, as you can probably tell. But of course, you're gonna have to deal with the fact that there's gonna be a lot of motion blur on the Xiaomi, as opposed to a much nicer, well, comparatively speaking, a much nicer result on the S25. There is a lot of artifacting and sharpening there. So with that said, we're at the end of this comparison. Now, let's just get one thing straight. I did not expect things to be this close in this comparison, not by a long shot, because the Xiaomi 14 Ultra is literally, almost literally, a generation behind the S25 Ultra. That says a lot given just how close things were, given the fact that in numerous areas the Xiaomi 14 Ultra pulled ahead. I'm not just talking about night mode here, there are definitely other areas where the Xiaomi just performed slightly better. And that alone is more than good enough, given the fact that the S25 has had a lot more time to marinate and it's just lacking flavor at this point. It's quite an analogy, but well, it makes perfect sense when you think about it, because it's kind of sad that I can kind of understand why people are disappointed with the S25 Ultra. It's not because it's lacking upgrades, or rather it's because the upgrades that we have, they've been implemented well, but there's still so many other small problems, especially the processing and the way white balance is handled and so on and so forth, so many inconsistencies that it produces disappointing results over and over. That's what is the real problem, in my opinion, as opposed to anything else. Like, we don't need major upgrades on the S25, no. We need software updates more than anything else. That's what needs to be happening, and that's exactly what can fix the S25 Ultra. There's a small chance that might happen. Samsung has done that before. They have drastically improved with software updates previously, so I have some hope. But of course, don't just buy this device hoping that it'll improve. That's definitely not the way to go. And well, I hope you guys enjoyed. I definitely hope to make the Xiaomi 15 Ultra's camera comparison soon. That is going to be very interesting to say the least. So I'll see you guys soon with those. Cheers.